Let's turn our attention to some specific threats your application will face. One popular form of attack these days is the cross-site scripting attack, or XSS. In a cross-site scripting attack, a malicious user will try to have your website load a malicious script into the user's browser, and it could be a script or an ActiveX control or even some malicious HTML. They'll try to do this by getting to your site and trying to get your site to accept some input from a form input or a query string and have your site echo back that input into a page without the proper encoding. Once this happens, your users become vulnerable to any number of problems. For instance, malicious script could try to inspect the cookies the browser holds on your site and steal information inside. They could also try to modify settings in the user's browser or force the browser to download malware or a virus and make it look like it came from your site. Malicious script can also modify the content your site displays. In other words, it can make your site look or display something that you didn't want it to. And some of the worst cross-site scripting attacks lead to account hijacking, where a malicious user can gain access to the real user's credentials or impersonate that user on your site. Let me show you a few tips about cross-site scripting. Let's look at the following scenario. Imagine that we want to give the user the ability to enter some HTML when they are entering the review for a restaurant. Just to spruce things up a bit. In other words, instead of just saying, great, let's say this restaurant is emphasis, great, close emphasis. And if I try to save this, ASP.NET will automatically reject this request to prevent cross-site scripting attacks, because ASP.NET is going to look for anything that resembles HTML and just flat out reject the request. And you might say, well, what's so wrong about emphasis tags? They're not dangerous. And that's true, but ASP.NET is not trying to make any distinctions here. Anything that looks like HTML is going to be rejected. If you are sure that you want the user to be able to upload some HTML to your server, then there are ways to circumvent this request validation, but you have to be extremely careful. One option is to come to the destination for this post, which is the edit action in the reviews controller, and completely disable this request validation by using the validate input false attribute. Now if I do a build, I should be able to come back to the application, and let's go back where we're trying to enter the string and click save. And this request is successfully processed. Now we still have a problem in that the HTML is being shown encoded here, but that's just because Razor is going to encode everything by default, which is good. That is another defense against cross-site scripting, and we can fix that easily. However, this validate input false is completely disabling the checks for cross-site scripting and malicious HTML. And really, we only need HTML inside of one specific property. Let me show you an alternative to validate input false. What we'll do is come to the models folder and open up a review. And on the one property where I want to allow HTML, I'm going to use the allow HTML attribute that will allow HTML to flow through to that property, but nowhere else where that attribute is not in place. And then we do have to make a slight change to the reviews controller to get this to work. First of all, we are going to take off validate input. We don't want that around. And instead of taking an ID in a form collection, we're going to place the updated review here as an action parameter. That means model binding will take place. We'll move the HTML into that property. We're not going to look up that review and use try update model anymore. Instead, we expect that review to be fully populated from information that the model binder was able to put together. All we really need to do is make sure that model state is valid before we try to save changes. And what changes are we going to save? We're going to use the Entity Framework 4.1 API to say, here is a review that is already in the database. I just want you to take these values and treat them as modified so that you can issue an update statement to the database to apply these changes into the database. And given those changes, I should be able now to do a build. And we should be able to come out and edit this restaurant. And I can still save HTML into the database. That's great. Of course, Razor is still showing it as encoded. So let's go and fix that. Every review is shown by this partial underscore review.cshtml view. I'm going to use the html.raw helper to say go ahead and output this value without encoding. And now if I refresh the page, we'll see This restaurant is great.